Okay, I see we're live now. Great. So good morning, Courtney, Jeff, and good morning to anybody who's watching live. This is the third series of webinars that we're doing on think tank methods, which is an opportunity to explore different research methods to study think tanks. We've had a session on qualitative research about a month ago, and 2 weeks ago we had a session on social network analysis. They're all posted on the On Think Tank's website, so at the end of this session we'll put a note online about them. There's a video and the presentations to support the video. Today we have Courtney Tomey from Results for Development in Washington, D.C., and she's going to be telling us about quantitative survey analysis, providing an example of a recent study they've done on using surveys to study the effect of context on think tanks. As before, the way we run these webinars, Courtney, through a quick introduction, you can walk us through your presentation. Jeff and I, if we have any questions, we'll ask, or anybody else who joins the webinar, the Hangout during this hour, we'll ask you any questions. So we might interrupt you a couple of times, if that's okay. But if not, we'll wait for until the end to ask our questions. And then afterwards, we'll have a bit of a brief session to finish with questions or comments and a discussion about what might come next. We'll try to organize a final webinar in a couple of weeks or a bit more, where we will try to bring together some of the lessons we've learned over the last month or so. Okay, so Courtney, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Enrique. Thanks, Jeff, and thank you to anyone watching the webinar, participating. So I was very excited to be involved in this series. I think it's a really exciting series and just set of information on how you can best study think tanks, what methods to use. I should start with two caveats, though. The first is that when I originally pitched this to Enrique, I pitched it more as a mixed method session. And I think the reason why will become clear as I go through the presentation, but this is based on a study that R4D did with a number of partners that I'll talk a bit more about, that had a quantitative component that we faced a lot of challenges undertaking. So hopefully that'll come out over the course of the presentation, and I'm also happy to talk more about it as we get into the Q&A section. I should also say that I would define myself as a recovering economist, and so what that means is that even though I have some quantitative background, I was very much supported, this project was supported by a wide team of people, including some very talented statisticians, economists, and I would say if you are thinking about taking quantitative analysis on as a method for studying think tanks, would definitely recommend bringing together a great group of people to help support that, who have a much deeper understanding of quantitative analysis. So if we go to the next slide, this just shows basically what I'm hoping to do during today's presentation. I thought we could start with a little bit of an introduction about what is quantitative analysis, including what are the advantages and disadvantages of using it. And then I wanted to break this up into a few different things. First of all, talking a bit more about surveys and data, because this is actually one of the bigger challenges about undertaking this type of analysis in the think tank field. So I think it's important to spend some time on that. Next, I want to talk a little bit about methods of analysis, and I won't go too deep into this, but really just kind of start at a high level, what are the different types of analysis that you could undertake and what do they allow you to do in terms of understanding think tanks. And then finally, I want to end with a deeper dive into the linking context study, which is the study I mentioned in the introduction that R4D undertook with partners at the University of Washington, that uses quantitative analysis as one of a pretty deliberate and integrated set of mixed methods to study the relationship between think tank performance, decisions, and context. So starting with the introduction, if we could go to the next slide, thanks. What is quantitative analysis? Well, basic definition is it's the use of statistical or econometric methods to measure relationships between independent and dependent factors. Generally, if I were giving a presentation like this, I would probably focus on a specific type of quantitative analysis, probably skimming over the data collection component, which we'll talk a little bit about, and focus on something that goes more into OLS regression, structural equation models, something that focuses on a specific type of analysis, which you could do an entire course or set of courses on. The reason why I decided to do a higher level presentation in this case is that literature is that there really hasn't been as much quantitative analysis of think tanks, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So I thought for this presentation, starting at a high level, kind of trying to cover all of the bases about what sort of quantitative analysis you could do was the right place to start. And then, hopefully over time, as there is better data available, there will be more of a chance to get into each of these in more detail. But just to run through, there's a lot of different types of analysis you can do, everything from summary statistics, which I think hardcore economists would say is not really a type of analysis that you want to undertake, but in some cases, depending on the data quality that you have, it can be helpful and it can really be the only thing you can do, all the way down the line to structural equation models, which I'll talk a little bit about in one of the future or in a few minutes. And if you look at these really increase in terms of the complexity and the logistical needs, but they also increase over the course of the, or over the arrows in terms of the sophistication and what they allow you to do. So moving to the next slide. So a little bit about advantages and disadvantages of quantitative analysis, specifically for undertaking this sort of analysis for studying think tanks. There are a number of advantages, and this is one of the reasons why we wanted to undertake quantitative analysis as part of our study of think tanks that I'll talk about at the end of the presentation. First of all, it allows for an assessment of trends across larger samples. So I watched, for example, the case study presentation that was done as the first one of these think tank method sections. I think case study analysis is really fantastic. It's really challenging, though, to use case studies to look at a very wide swath of different organizations. So if what you're trying to do is look at the universe of think tanks, or the universe of people working within think tanks, it's really tough to do unless you're using quantitative analysis, which is one of the major advantages. It allows for assessment of trends across larger samples. Second, it allows for, and I put this in quotes, simpler comparisons of unlike units. So for example, if you have an interest in think tanks and you recognize that think tanks across the world have very different characteristics, in some cases they're very difficult to compare, quantitative analysis allows you to break this down into very concrete variables and generally a limited number of concrete variables to do comparisons across unlike units. And that's definitely one of the advantages, and depending upon your research question, it can really be the only way to look at this. Third advantage, it allows for corrections of endogeneity or unobserved heterogeneity. And I apologize that the last word on that bullet fell off the slide. Not all quantitative analysis does this, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but to the extent that you do have unobserved variables or endogeneity across variables that you want to correct for, quantitative analysis is definitely the way to do it. Like I said, I'll talk a bit more about that in relation to our work. And then finally, it can allow, and I think it's important to recognize it can allow, it doesn't necessarily allow, the researcher to assess causality and not just correlation. So if what you really want to find out is if something affects something else, not just if it's correlated, quantitative analysis is definitely the way to do it. So for a lot of different research questions, I think this type of analysis is really the only way to go. And as I said, of those advantages, some techniques allow you to take advantage of those, and some don't. Now, there's also disadvantages, and I think this is really important to recognize as well. First, the methods can gloss over nuanced differences between, in our case, in the think tank field, organizations. So, you know, on the flip side of the coin of being able to break things down into concrete variables, what this means is that if there are small or nuanced differences between organizations, you're probably not going to be able to pick that up very well in a larger sample using quantitative analysis. Second, and this is a related point, it can be much harder to use quantitative analysis to have revealed conclusions or findings. So I think one of the great things about case studies and other methods is that when you actually get out and start doing the research, there's you know, things outside of your original hypotheses and original research questions that can come up that you didn't expect at all. With quantitative analysis, because you're defining a model based on specific variables, it's much harder to have those revealed conclusions. You kind of go in with a sense of this is what your model looks like, and if there's things going on outside of that, it's harder to find those out from quantitative analysis. Not impossible, but much more difficult. And then the third disadvantage that I do want to talk a bit more about is the challenge of data. And I would say actually at this point in time in the think tank research field, this is probably one of the biggest disadvantages and probably one of the reasons why there has been less quantitative analysis in this field. There's just not a lot of good data out there, and I'll talk more about that because I think that's really important. And if we're looking at, you know, whether or not we want to see more of this type of analysis in the field, I think this has to be the first step. Okay, so moving to the next slide. Okay. So as I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about surveys and data. This is probably oversimplified and probably obvious to everyone that's watching this, but basically there are three ways that you can bring together data for your research if you do decide to do quantitative analysis of think tanks. The first is using existing data. The second is collecting new data. And then the third is actually doing both and merging data. In terms of using existing data, and I would be interested in kind of throwing this out to the group of people that is participating on this call, I will say we went through a pretty extensive exercise when we started our project on linking context to see were there existing data sources that we could use, and we really didn't find anything. We ended up by default having to collect our own data to do this analysis because there really just weren't any data sets out there that we felt like were high enough quality, or there were some that we kind of heard about, but they weren't publicly available, which is another thing that I think is important that we should try to be pushing for in this field. And so immediately that first option of using existing data actually fell off the table. What we ended up doing was actually both collecting new data and using existing data, but the existing data we used was all about context. So it wasn't about think tanks specifically. For any variables we wanted about think tanks, we had to do our own data collection. Okay, so moving to the next slide. If we want to dig into the collecting your own data piece, I think there's a number of considerations to bring up. And as I said, I want to bring this up because I think anyone considering doing this type of analysis probably is going to be facing the challenge of collecting your own data. So the first is that you have to develop a model to inform your variables, and that includes dependent and independent variables, which brings along its own challenges, but also is a really nice way of tying your hands to a specific model or set of relationships that you want to test. And that's the first step before doing any sort of data collection or survey design or anything like that. Second, you have to decide on your unit of analysis. In our case, and I think in most types of research questions I could think of in this field, the unit of analysis was the organization. So we were providing surveys to individuals within organizations, but they were answering the survey questions for the entire organization. But that is something to consider. Third, you have to consider sample in order to have significant You have to consider bias, and it's a big issue depending on what type of data collection from a certain type of think tank, which means that it's hard to actually generalize your findings. We'll talk a bit more about that with respect to the study that we did. Fourth, in terms of the survey itself, assuming that you're doing a survey, there are a few different types of surveys that you can undertake. The first is a single cross-section, which basically means it's a one-time survey. You send it out to a wide sample of think tanks or individuals, and you get that one response. Second, you can do a repeated cross-section. What this means is that you have a survey. You actually repeat that survey over time, but not necessarily to the same group of people. It allows you to do some analysis of changes over time, although it's a little bit limited because you're not asking the same questions from the same people. And then finally, you could do try to put together a panel data set, and that involves doing the same survey to the same individuals over time. There are certainly challenges with that. It's definitely the hardest one to do. In our case, we did a single cross-section. Considering in the future we may do a repeated cross-section. Fifth, have to consider your method of data collection. This seems simple and logistical and not that exciting, I think, to the average researcher, but it is really important. Are you doing in-person surveys? Are you doing phone surveys? Are you providing an electronic copy that people respond to and send in? There's a lot of options and a lot of pros and cons, as well as if you're doing a very simple survey, simple sort of SMS responses. I think that would be more challenging to do in the think tank space. It's something we've used in other fields. And then the sixth consideration, which I think is really important, is there existing data that you can merge? So if you do have data available to you, even if it's not the full swath of data that you want, all of the variables you want, there is real value in finding existing data sets that you can merge into the new data that you're collecting. I'll talk a bit more about that in the example that I provide. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So that was a little bit about data collection and surveys. I want to talk again pretty briefly about analysis. So in one of the earlier slides, I showed this figure that shows certainly not the full universe of different types of analysis you can do with quantitative data, but gives a few examples. And if you're looking at this from left to right, this definitely goes from the least complicated but least sophisticated down to the most complicated and most sophisticated. In terms of deciding what type of analysis you want to do, I think there's two major questions. What do you want to test? And so these bullet points below that show different things that you can test with different types of analysis, but not with all types of analysis. So changes over time, changes compared to a counterfactual, correlations, causations. These are all things that you can test, but you really do need to pick and choose what type of analysis you're going to do, because some types of analysis will answer some of those questions and others won't. The second big question is, what can you test with the data you have? Now, if you are doing your own data collection, this is a question you should be asking yourself on the earlier side so that you're collecting the type of data that will allow you to do the type of analysis you want. But sometimes the data you get actually kind of ties your hands or dictates what you can do and can't do. For these analyses that are on the right side of the diagram at the top of the slide, they definitely require much more, bigger sample sizes. They require a lot in terms of the type of data you need. And so, depending on what kind of data you have, you may be able to do some of these. You may not. Okay, moving to the next slide. Okay, this is just taking on some of the simpler types of data analysis. And as I said, if you asked an economist, they might look at these first two types and say this is absolutely not what I would consider quantitative analysis. But I think these are important things to look at because sometimes these are really the only types of analysis that you can do. Summary statistics are certainly the easiest to do. They're valuable if you are just looking for averages of the variables across a data set, so wanting to know the average funding that think tanks report receiving, the average number of staff they have, the average number of staff with PhDs. There is some value in knowing that, and you can also use this to compare averages across different subgroups of a data set. So let's say you want to know whether the average number of PhD researchers in an organization is greater in African organizations than in Asian organizations. That's the type of thing you can do with summary statistics. There's certainly stories on the surface that you're not about with summary statistics, but if you're really just looking at comparing averages, it's a simple type of analysis you can do using Excel or really anything. Cross-tabulations gets to be a little bit more complicated and a little bit more interesting. So cross-tabulations will allow you to do basic correlations between variables in the data set. So if you want to know with the different variables you have, and I'll talk about an example in a moment, if you want to know whether or not they're correlated at all, again, you can't dig into the story behind that. If there's any sort of unobserved heterogeneity, you won't be able to look at that with cross-tabulations, but you can do these basic sets of analyses that are useful. You can also use significance tests for this, which is really helpful in that it gives you a sense of, okay, you see a relation between these two variables. You can figure out whether or not that's a statistically significant relationship or not, which you can't really do with summary statistics. So that's the kind of simple end of the analysis spectrum. If we move to the next slide. Okay, this gets into a little bit more sophisticated analysis. Now, this goes everything from ordinary least squares regressions, which is a model you put together, and I'll talk more about this when I talk about the study that we did, all the way down to structural equation models, which get to be very, very complicated, but also allow you to look at things like endogeneity and causality, which is really valuable. Again, not every type of analysis is going to allow you to answer every question. I think that's an important takeaway. But what this type of analysis, what regression analysis can allow you to do is to assess the impact of changes in think tank characteristics over time. So if you have a panel data set, that's something you can look for. It allows you to correct for unobserved heterogeneity, which is important, and it can allow you to assess causation. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. Okay, so this is just an example, and I've already talked through a little bit of this, so I'll just spend a moment on it. So let's say that you have an interest in looking at the relationship between think tank funding and placement of research in top-tier journals for an organization. Qualitative research will allow you to do a really nuanced study of that for potentially a small sample of organizations, but won't necessarily let you look at that in terms of a larger relationship with larger trends. If you use summary statistics, you'll be able to look at the average think tank funding across your data set and the average placement of research in top-tier journals, and you might be able to break that up into subgroups, which is valuable. Getting into cross-tabs, you actually can get a number for what the relationship is between those two variables, and you can look at the significance of that. But then what regression analysis allows you to do is answer the question of whether one actually leads to the other. It may be that greater think tank funding leads to more placement of research in top-tier journals, or that because an organization has more research in top-tier journals, they end up getting more funding. It may also be that's a dual relationship, which is entirely possible. But regression analysis can allow you to look at that. It also could allow you to look at whether there is unobserved heterogeneity. So for example, maybe it's not that think tank funding is leading to more placement of research in top-tier journals directly, but maybe there's this middle variable, which is that think tanks that have increased funding have a larger number of PhD researchers on staff, and that's actually what's leading to placement of research in top-tier journals. Regression analysis is really the only one of these that's going to allow you to answer that question for sure. Okay, so moving to the next slide, and this is the final section of the presentation. I want to do a deeper dive into what quantitative analysis looks like, the good, the bad, and the ugly, in a real-life case. So I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation this research study that was led by Results for Development, which is the organization I work with, and the University of Washington with funding from the Think Tank Initiative. The study was called Linking Think Tank Performance, Decisions, and Context, and the title probably says it all, but the objective of this work was to explore the relationship between political, economic, and social context factors and think tank strategic behavior and performance. So this is a pretty complicated set of questions we're looking at, and there were definitely multiple research questions within there. For this work, we ended up using mixed methods. So we wanted to use quantitative analysis. We did use quantitative analysis, but we also realized that for the type of questions we had, it was important to look beyond just the numbers. So we did an extensive literature mapping, comparative case studies, interviews and focus group discussions with think tank representatives, executive directors, senior researchers, senior communications officers in multiple countries. And then we kind of brought all of this together to give us our results. And the study is fairly recent. It was completed in 2014, and you can find the full study, including the section on the quantitative analysis, on the R4D website. Okay, so if we go to the next page, or the next slide, I thought what we could do is just kind of walk through, the things that I've talked about earlier in the presentation and how these played out in this particular research study. So the first thing we had to do was define the model we were looking at, and I apologize, some of these photos or snapshots are a little bit fuzzy. But what we did in our case was define a fairly broad model. We had an outcome variable for think tank I and country S, and we said that was a function of a number of different things. First of all, characteristics of the think tank itself. Second, context for the country, and I think that's one potentially limiting factor of our study, but we can come back to that later. A third term, which was basically how exogenous context interacts with endogenous characteristics, and then an error term. So in our case, the unit of analysis was the individual organization. The context variables we used, as I said, were at the country level. And some of the challenges we faced in defining this model were, first of all, how do we define outcomes? So the dependent variable on the left-hand side of the equation, that was really challenging for us to figure out, okay, how are we actually measuring outcomes? How are we defining outcomes, but then how are we going to measure them? Is it think tank perception of success? Is it an outside opinion of whether a think tank has a good reputation or not? There were a lot of different ideas we played around with. And the second challenge is how do we assess think tank characteristics? And this is where our data collection comes in. And so what we ended up deciding to do, because there wasn't a great data source out there already, was to field our own survey, which I'll talk about in a few slides. So moving to the next slide, I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but we did start out, in addition to having our model, which I explained on the last slide, we set out with a set of hypotheses that we started with that were related to certain types of context factors we thought were especially important and that we needed to be able to assess somehow, and the relationship between that context factor and characteristics of the think tank. So this is one piece of a very, very long table that we have in the actual report, but it just kind of gives a sense of what we had to set up on the outset even to do the analysis. So moving to the next slide, this gets into our data. So as I said, we ended up deciding to do a combination of collecting our own data and then also using existing data, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But the data that we used, we decided to do a survey that we sent out electronically. The table on the right hand of the slide shows what the different types of questions we asked for. So we had 6 different sections, and they all focused on different characteristics of think tanks. We used what we called a convenience sample. What this meant was kind of what it sounds like. We ended up sampling organizations that we already knew of, or that people we knew. That makes things a lot easier. It also definitely presents the possibility of bias because, you know, the type of organizations that we know or that our colleagues know may fit certain characteristics, and we may be missing in a systematic way other types of organizations. For example, smaller organizations, less well-known ones, newer ones, that type of thing. We did do the survey in 3 languages to try to get a pretty wide global coverage, but this is also limiting. We did in English, Spanish, and French. Definitely missed some countries because of that. And what we ended up having was 94 respondents in 48 countries. So some of the challenges. We had 94 respondents, but that's out of 300 surveys sent. So that's a pretty small response rate, although honestly, if you talk to people who field these types of surveys, it's not that bad. But in terms of what we wanted to be able to analyze, definitely have the power that we wanted in our results. Of the 94 that we received, only 61% came back completed. In some cases, that wasn't a big deal because some of the variables or some of the questions that people skipped, we ended up being able to just drop from our analysis. We didn't have to worry about it. So we were able to use more than 61% of the surveys that we received, but there certainly were questions that we cared a lot about, especially some of the more complicated questions on outcomes that people didn't respond to. And for those, because they were such an important part of our model, we ended up just not being able to use that data. The final challenge was in the development of the survey itself. It's a complicated process. We talked to a lot of different experts in terms of how you form questions, and you know how you're most likely to get an unbiased response. That definitely took a lot of time and effort. So then moving on to the next slide, this is just to show that we did try to combine this with other data sources. So we had think tank characteristics, which we had to ask questions of think tanks about. But then for a number of our context variables, we were able to go to other sources and merge the data. So for things like the level of political competition, government effectiveness, GDP per capita, there's really good existing data sources out there for those, and we could just merge that data when we were doing our analysis. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So what this all meant is that despite the fact that we went into this wanting to do an OLS regression and have that be our analysis, we really ended up not having the data to be able to do that. We knew that with the data quality we had, we just weren't able, we knew we wouldn't get the results that we would feel comfortable putting out. So instead we focused on summary statistics and cross tabulations, which provided a somewhat interesting story. So this is one example of our summary statistics tables that we have in the full report. This just gives a sense of, I believe this is for communications and policy influence strategies, what percentage of think tanks or number of think tanks actually decided to use different types of strategies or reported back, which was a useful set of information to have. It doesn't allow a lot of sophisticated lessons to be pulled from that or results to be pulled, but it's an interesting set of information. Moving to the next slide, we also were able to do some cross tabulations, which allowed us to take some of our context variables, take some of our think tank strategy variables, and say, is there a relationship we want to look at here? So just to give an example, if you look down, I should have had this circled on the slide, but if you look down at the final row, policy adopted, this is a self-reported variable that think tanks said, whether they were able to report over the last 12 months that a policy that they had proposed or policy based on research that they had shared had been adopted. And then if you look at the third column, GDP per capita, that's one of our exogenous context variables. You'll see the star there means that we did find a statistically significant relationship between those two variables, and negative relationship. this, the difficult thing about crosstabs is that they're interesting, but they just kind of give you the headline of the story. They don't allow you to take a deeper dive and say, well, why is that the case? There's a lot of potential reasons, right? And that's what regression analysis could have allowed us to do. But it's an interesting story to start the discussion. And what this did allow us to do was say, these are some questions that we might want to press on in the future using other techniques, because they do reveal an interesting finding. So if we move to the final slide, just a few very high-level lessons about this type of analysis. I know I've gone over the 30 minutes I was supposed to, but all of these hopefully have come out over the course of the presentation. And I don't want to present a completely negative view of quantitative analysis in this field, but I also think it's important to go in with a recognition of what some of the challenges are. So first lesson, there were significant challenges to fielding a quantitative survey in the field, and those should be weighed out. Not to say it shouldn't be done, but it's definitely a difficult thing to do. Second, with proper data, quantitative analysis has the potential to assess causation and correct for endogeneity, which I think is really important and something that a lot of studies that we looked at in our initial literature mapping for this work really didn't do, and ended up kind of raising more questions than answering. And then final lesson, and this is just my opinion, I think probably while quantitative analysis is really valuable, even if you do overcome these initial challenges, you probably still want to take a mixed methods approach, because there is so much going on within think tanks and within the decisions that people and organizations are making, that it's really important to bring in that smart and rigorous qualitative work to combine with the quantitative work. So I think that's all I have. Thank you all very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer or try to answer any questions or turn you in the direction of someone on the team that can.
Thank you, Courtney. That was excellent. That was very good, actually, very clear, and the technology worked fine. I know Marcos said if he has any questions, he's going to ask them through chat. Marcos, do you have a question for Courtney now? So question one. Oh, you can read it. So I'll read it out loud for anybody listening. So what type of data would you propose that should be gathered about think tanks?
That's a great question. I think at a high level, it depends on what your research question is. I'm definitely a strong believer of if you are going to go out and spend the energy and time and resources and money to do data collection, that you should start with a research question and start with a model. That said, I think there's a lot of really interesting research questions in the field that could be answered with better data. With our study, we were particularly interested in characteristics about think tank funding, think tank strategies, so decisions that organizations about research and resources. And I think all of these things these are all sort of subsets of variables or questions that we could do some interesting analysis if we had better information on them. So I'm not sure that really answers your question. I do think it's important to start with the research questions and let that be the guide, because the other challenge with this sort of data collection, and we face this even with our survey, is that you definitely get survey fatigue even within an individual survey. So organizations would start and they would look and see that we were asking 100 questions, and they would immediately just kind of say, we're not interested in going through this whole thing, or we'll come back to it later. So I'm not sure that answered your question, but
I have a sorry, here's the follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, there's a rich literature on how to assess policy impact. How does that feed into the model you use?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we try to do is the first place and the major place that shows up is what sort of how we define our outcome variables. I think that there were a few things we could have done, and some of them we decided not to do. So one option would be to use non-think tank specific data about policy changes and try to somehow relate that to individual think tanks in a country. We considered doing that. In some ways it would be the most uncontroversial, I guess, variable we could use for policy influence, because it's actually saying this is a policy that passed in this country. What we realized, though, is that it would be really, really difficult to connect, a policy change that happened in Rwanda with research that particular organizations did. So we decided not to do that, because since our unit of analysis was the organization, we would need to somehow be able to tie that policy impact back to the organization. And that's something that came out. I mean, I use Rwanda as an example. We did some of our focus group discussions and interviews in Rwanda, and definitely something that came out was, whenever we talked to organizations, they were, trying to tie policy changes to their research. And in some cases, they had very good evidence for that. In other cases, I think it was more questionable. So what we decided to do was we decided to use an outcome variable about self-reported policy impact, which, from the statement I just made, you could see there's definitely bias there, right? But what we ended up doing was we, for that variable, outcome ways that you can define policy impact based on, as you said, this really extensive and strong literature. What we created was this thing we called this cascade of influence. And the idea was to try to define variables around policy influence that went from, an organization whose research made it into the hands of policymakers all the way up to, a policy was enacted and this organization's research was basically cited in the debate, or like there was evidence you could find that clearly that organization's work built into that policy change. And we defined variables, we defined survey questions and then variables around each of those parts of the cascade of influence. The biggest problem with this is that it's still self-reported, and that's definitely a challenge, and it's definitely one of the reasons why we actually decided that probably the data that we collected was not strong enough to put the time and energy into doing this more extensive analysis. But the variables themselves, we really did try to go back to the large policy impact literature and use that to help define those survey questions and those variables.
I have a question, Courtney, about the data. You mentioned that some of the data was not robust enough, and a lot of it wasn't publicly available. But of the data you found, and that you said it wasn't robust enough, wasn't good enough, what were their main shortcomings? I mean, this project was a project you worked on for the think tank initiative. Mm-hmm. And they've been collecting data, and even in their evaluation of the first phase, they made a point of saying that some of the data the evaluators were not able to use all the data they collected. Can you tell us a bit more about the shortcomings that existing data sources have?
Sure. Yeah. So I think there were a number of shortcomings. The biggest one, and what ended up really kind of stopping us from even looking further into a lot of the existing data sets we could find, was the size of the sample. So for the type of analysis we were hoping to do, we recognized that, for the complexity of the model, we would need a pretty large sample size, and I would need to go back to the actual report to look at some of our calculations to see what we decided we needed. But a lot of the data that's out there, so for example, data from the think tank initiative, there are some interesting surveys that have been done as parts of evaluation of programs like the Global Development Network PEM program, which R4D was actually a part of as well. those are focused on, somewhere between 15 to 50 organizations. So it's a pretty small number. Now, obviously, you can see from our survey that we ended up having a sample size of, when you drop some of the important, when you drop some of the incomplete surveys, we probably had a sample size of about 75, so it's not that much larger, but we definitely went out hoping to get a larger sample size. So size, I think, is the #1 problem when it comes to the doing the type of analysis we were hoping to do. Beyond that, I think this issue of bias in the sample is another really big issue. Most of the cases we looked at where we were looking at data and considering whether or not to use it, it was based on a sample that was either a convenience sample, kind of like the one we used, but a convenience sample that was sent out to a much smaller set of organizations to begin with. So we knew that what we would be getting out of that was responses from a certain type of organization, and if we wanted to look at kind of wider, more generalizable trends and findings, that would not work. So that was the second piece. And then, the third thing is that it's really, really difficult to define a survey, and I'm sure that any of you all listening can relate to this. It's really difficult to define a survey. It's really difficult to ask questions in a way, especially if it's asking about experience and stuff that's not, simple like how many staff do you have, which is even challenging sometimes. Any of these variables that are more experience or potentially subjective, it's difficult to write those questions. And so when we went back and looked at some of the questions that in surveys that some of the existing data sets were based on, we had some questions about what the sort of quality of the data would be. So, actually a lot of the things that we saw that we worried about with existing data sets, we ended up having exactly the same problem. So, I want to make it clear that I think this is a challenge across the board, but those are probably some of the biggest issues that we saw with the existing work, as well as to maybe a lesser extent, but to a certain extent, our data has as well.
So,
thank you. Jeff,
yeah, if I can just jump in. So I guess one of the questions that I have then as well is it's interesting that you chose the survey approach, and it sounds like you have some clear reasoning behind that. To what extent did you try to work with, for lack of a better word, found data or data that was kind of made available on websites and scraping that way? I mean, or through charity commission websites in the UK or equivalent in the US, and I know that you had a global sample set, so that might have proved a problem. But I mean, I guess why not try that kind of approach, or did you, and what challenges did you have with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's something that in the study we did end up merging different data sets, and so we did some of that. But I think when it comes to variables about think tanks as opposed to about exogenous context, there probably is more we could have done. You're right that there's really great organizations out there that publish information on think tank funding, some of the basic variables about size of think tanks, year of establishment, things like that. So I guess two things. First of all, for the most part, those were the variables that actually were much easier to collect. And given that we were already doing a survey and that we knew that there were questions that we wanted to ask about strategies and decisions and perceived outcomes, we would need to do the survey. It was just as easy to kind of put the questions in, so we wouldn't have to really manipulate, okay, from this website we can get that this organization started in this year. So there was, I think a lot of it was just we were already doing the survey, so it made sense to do that. I also think there is a non-negligible amount of effort that would go into kind of scraping what's on existing websites and trying to connect that with organizations, because sometimes there's information up there, but it's a couple of years old, and so then do you say, okay, well, we'll try to correct for the fact that for some organizations we have funding data from 2010 and for some we have it from 2014. That said, what we did do is actually in other sections of the work for the literature mapping and things like that, we did definitely refer to a lot of existing websites and kind of pull, not so much for the quantitative analysis, but to talk about, basically the like developing the model and things like that. There definitely was information that came from some of those existing websites.
Thank you, Courtney. I have a question about sort of the outcome of the study. So, I mean, can you tell us some of the interesting things that came out from the use of the survey to look at context and think tanks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a lot that came out. I will say as is probably clear in the presentation, we weren't able to draw as many conclusions as we hoped to, and I should have pulled up the study in advance to be able to turn quickly to. But we did see some really interesting relations. I'm trying to pull this up while I'm talking. We did see some interesting, relationships between variables like some of our political and economic variables, and in particular decisions that think tanks made. We had a harder time connecting outcomes with, or perceived outcomes, reported outcomes, with some of the context factors, and there's probably a lot of reasons for that, a lot of it having to do with maybe the fact that the data was a little bit messier than we had hoped. But we did really see some interesting correlations, and in some cases statistically significant correlations between what sort of strategies that think tanks were employing and context factors such as some of the political context factors, things around political competition, economic factors, and some like legal factors around like the civil society environment for civil society working openly, things like that. I apologize, I can't get the report up right now to refer to some of the specific findings, but there were some interesting relationships that are worth looking into. Like I said, we were very cautious in the discussion to say, these are interesting relationships. There may be a lot more to the story that we're unable to look at, but I think it's a good starting point if you did want to continue this work with either a better and stronger data set, or to take a few of those and say maybe you could build some comparative case studies around them.
Thank you. And I should note that there's a very good critical synthesis of the study on the think tanks site through a series that Results for Development edited early in the year. So sort of content there. I'll share it and the paper through the page we're going to set up for this webinar. Marcos, you have another question. Could you talk a bit more about the possibilities to study change through surveys?
Sure. Actually, could I get a little bit of a clarification? So possibilities for study change through survey. Possibilities to study changes, like changes in organizations? Okay. So I think the big thing that you would need to do to look at changes in organizations would be to set up probably a panel data set as opposed to, you could potentially, actually you probably could do a repeated cross-section. This is something that I would definitely want to bring in a true real economist on to provide feedback on. But what you can do is if you do a repeated survey, ideally looking at the same organization over time or sets of organizations over time, but even potentially a repeated cross-section where you're at least kind of getting a sense of what trends you're seeing across time across all think tanks. I think there's a lot of potential there, because then what you can do is set up, every few years doing a survey of organizations regarding changes in human resources, new challenges faced. I mean, those are obviously, well, at least the challenges are kind of fuzzy variables, but you could certainly look at more concrete, like funding changes, human resources, communications activities, things like that. And that could be incredibly interesting to look at. Definitely would have some challenges, in particular with a panel survey, because you probably would have some dropout. You also, one of the challenges with having the organization being your unit of analysis is you may have different people responding to the survey in different years. And so, you know, to the extent that you have questions that are a little bit more subjective and not easy just to kind of go to the books and say this is what's going on, some of that change in response may not be a change in what the actual think tank is doing. It may be different people's opinions vary. But that said, I mean, I think that there's a huge potential there, and especially if you kind of want to look at the environment of think tanks as a whole, as opposed to what a single think tank is doing and changing over time. I think a repeated cross-section at least would be a really good way to do that.
Great. Thank you very much, Courtney. If I mean, Jeff, Marcos, do you have any more questions? We're coming to the hour. Great. Well, that's extremely interesting, Courtney. Thank you very. What was that, Jeff? You just made a.
Well, it's less of a question and more of a thought. I mean, I know that R4D has done some work actually looking into indicators for assessing impact of investment, and they got involved with an initiative, I think they're called the IRIS Impact Investment Indicators or something like that, and where a group of people got together and kind of thought about what sort of indicators and data make sense. And it strikes me that if this is the kind of analysis we want to be doing of think tanks, and I know that CGD is interested, and I know in the UK the think tank review is interested, Nesta is interested, you know, if some sort of initiative like that is something that might be a useful way of starting to tackle some of these data deficiencies.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point. And I will say, you know, I do want to leave this kind of webinar with a feeling of, despite the fact that I've talked a lot about the challenges, because I think they're really important to recognize, there's so much that this type of data could do if it was collected well, if it was, you know, planned out really well, and if, you know, we could kind of walk away and say we have a data set that we have confidence in. Like I said, that's hard to do, but I think there's so many questions that you can answer with data that are much harder, if at all possible, to answer with, you know, just qualitative analysis. So it's definitely something I think we should look into as a field. I think just kind of bringing in the experience of those, and there are certainly those beyond R4D, but those who have done this type of work and can point to where some of the pitfalls might be.
True, and I think trying to bring together existing data sets that quite a few of the current think tank funders have would help, would give us big numbers. And making that public would allow quite a few more people to join in and do research that you know, we can't centrally control or manage. So that should be an interesting sort of call to action for us and for others. We'll certainly try to advocate that from on think tanks.
And I should say, sorry, I forgot, and I should have mentioned earlier. That is actually something we employed with the think tank initiative survey. With a lot of the questions that we had that we wanted to ask, TTI was already asking them in their kind of annual survey that they were giving fundees, and so we actually ended up creating two versions of the survey. One for TTI grantees that cut out the questions that they were already asking, because we could actually use their data for that. So it ended up being a much shorter survey for TTI grantees, which I think really helped with the response rate. So the more that we can kind of look at who is already doing surveys and where can we combine without making the survey so long and crazy, I think that there's real potential there.
Great. Well, on that note, thank you very much, and it's been a very good session. And we'll, as soon as I can, we'll try to put this up on the On Think Tank's website, so you can watch the video and and download the presentation and the background methodology note. I'll put a link to the Think Tanks and Context paper in series as well, so you can look at it there. And that's it from us. We'll be back letting anybody watching know about a possible next webinar. And thank you, and see you then.
Great. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.